Magnetize your minis, flight stands, custom kits, and all the hobby supplies you'll need from themagnetbaron.com.
Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for Craftworld I'm Brent, and this is the unit focus video on Shroud Runners. In these videos, I discuss what the unit is, how it functions best on the table, and how to best overcome obstacles that exist to using it well. So here we go. Before I say anything else about Shroud Runners, I think I need to start by acknowledging that the models are freaking gorgeous. The last time elves were this hot, the result was a new Chaos God. And they're a totally new unit in 9th edition. Although, fun fact, the name was actually taken from a piece of war gear way back in the 2nd Ed Codex. And one of the things that I especially appreciate about this 9th Ed book is that the writers clearly did a deep dive into every previous iteration of Eldar, going all the way back to the early history of the franchise. And the result is a codex that interlaces rules and lore on the table in a way that makes even very competitive play feel much more narrative than it ever has before, and that's super cool. So, Shroud Runners, gorgeous. Nevertheless, when the Codex dropped, many of us were less than enthusiastic about scout bikes. They were inefficiently pointed compared to regular scatter bikes, that is, Wind Riders with scatter lasers, and many of the units that Shroud Runners have the greatest utility against could, at that time, be much more easily eliminated with powerful indirect fire. Now, since those brief and perhaps a bit overpowered halcyon days of the Codex's infancy, a points increase for Wind Riders with scatter lasers and a massive nerf to indirect fire have enabled Shroud Runners to emerge as more than just a pretty face. They have serious utility even in the highest levels of competitive play. They've appeared in lots of lists that have done well at GTs, some that have made it onto the podium in recent months. And this has been true since about the middle of this summer. So what are Shroud Runners, other than pretty faces? Shroud Runners are sleek 2-elf scout bikes with a pre-game move and niche firepower. They're a bit more durable than Wind Riders with both an extra wound and the ability not only to gain a light cover bonus, which bikes usually can't do, but also a +1 bonus to their save and cover in addition to the normal cover save because of the cloaks they have, just like regular foot scouts, bringing them to a 2+ armor save if they are in or behind a ruin. It's pretty good. A unit of 3 Shroud Runners puts out 18 scatter laser shots and 3 long rifle shots, all with a 36-inch range and a ballistic skill of 2 up, and because bikes don't incur the -1 penalty when moving and firing heavy weapons, they're generally still firing on the 2 up, regardless of what you're doing with them. They can also automatically do D3 mortal wounds to an enemy unit within 12 inches at the beginning of your opponent's movement phase or charge phase by using the 1-point stratagem wire weave grenades. Essentially, you spend 1 CP and they smite something and reduce its charge distance. That's so good. Lastly, they have battle focus. They auto-advance 22, just like all Eldari bikes. And they also have the ability to strip cover bonuses from an enemy unit within 12 inches when that unit is targeted, but only by your Rangers and Shroud Runners in the shooting phase. It's so easy to forget about that. It's good. That's a fun extra. In any event, overall, it's a really solid bag of tricks for 105 points. Really solid. Shroud Runners are a toolbox unit. That means they're a unit that brings a wide variety of tactical options to the table, but may need to be used differently depending on the matchup, depending on who you're playing against. So these are the things they can do. Shroud Runners can be a target elimination unit, especially with Jinx. They can be a move blocking unit, something that's used to keep your enemy's most important killers from getting where they need to be. They can be an alpha strike unit, a unit that hits the enemy early and hard. They can be a board control unit, something that blocks out enemy deep strikers. They can also be a scoring unit, right? Either for secondaries or for primaries, and I'll talk about that in a moment. There's a lot of utility to these pretty scout bikes. A single unit of Shroud Runners in the hands of a skilled player is like it's like a Swiss Army knife. I don't know, maybe American boys who grew up before 1998 are the only people who know. I actually don't know if the Swiss have ever even heard of Swiss Army knives. I don't know. Somebody from Switzerland, let me know in the comments. But they're just highly versatile units that reward nuanced play. Unlike, say, a unit of swooping hawks, which are likely to do more or less the same thing in every single matchup, right? Your swooping hawks, they jump out, they shoot a thing, they jump away. Yes, the best units to target will depend on what the matchup is, but hawks are pretty much always doing the same thing. Not so with Shroud Runners, and I think this is true of a lot of Eldar units. One of the hard things about playing Craft Worlds is that how you play has to change based on what the matchup is, and that requires deeper knowledge of the game and fewer mistakes. And that's what it means to have a high skill cap army that also has a pretty low skill floor. Like, it's easy to make mistakes with Craft Worlds. Against Tau, Orcs, Necrons, Harlequins, other Craftworld Eldar, pretty much anything that isn't in power armor, Shroud Runners are pretty effective target elimination units. They're pretty powerful killers. The easiest way to use them in this role is to forego the pregame move and have them hover in your backfield, throwing out 36-inch range, high strength, volume of fire, with that 2-up to pick up, to hit, for reasons I already explained, to pick up enemy light infantry, or to put a few more wounds on targets with moderately high toughness. They're really good against orcs, by the way. T5 orcs that have crappy armor. Man, orcs hate scatter lasers. Your Shroud Runners can then battle focus to disappear out of line of sight in your backfield. And although they aren't likely to feel like wrecking ball units that pick up whole squads on their own, given that they're both easy to keep alive and also, with the 36-inch range, easy to position within range of an opponent, a squad of Shroud Runners that survives the whole game, which they can, might very well put out 90 scatter laser shots and 15 sniper shots in the course of 5 turns. And if you compare the overall damage to a similarly costed one-and-done trading unit of Banshees cost about the same as Shroud Runners, you might find that the Shroud Runners are much stronger target elimination units than you originally thought. It's just that because their damage output is spread over multiple turns, their brutality is less viscerally clear than that of the screamy murder elves or even shining spears. Now, to be fair, Banshees rarely target anything other than a high priority target, right? So all of the Banshee damage is going into something that you really want to die. While your Shroud Runners will occasionally find themselves with inefficient targeting options. Maybe there are a couple of turns where all they do is ping a rhino for a few wounds, or maybe they kill the last pretty flimsy model in an already badly maimed enemy light infantry squad. 2 or 3 turns, though, they're probably going to do some real work for you. And again, if you add it up, that's going to be, over the course of a game, substantial target elimination damage. And that backfield role that works especially well in Craftworld's list that just want to control one side of the board. And this is a popular way to play Craftworlds right now. So you seize your side of the board with D cannons and Banshees with a good charge threat range where your opponent just can't come into the middle of the table without getting slammed. And you score the objectives on your side, and you scout the enemy, and you score hidden path, and you do warp ritual or maybe psychic interrogation. You just keep your head down and you score, and you make it incredibly unappealing for your opponent to cross the midline of the table, and you try to outscore them. Now, there's some armies that this doesn't work against, like Necrons, who they're gonna outscore you because they can play the game that way too, but they'll get to 100 and you'll get to like 92 or 94. So sometimes that's not the way to do it. But in a lot of matchups, there are lots of lists that function that way quite effectively, and Shroud Runners can sort of slide seamlessly into a list that wants to play the game that way. And in either that kind of a list or a list that's a bit different, in the later part of the game, once your opponent has fewer target elimination units of her own left on the board, your Shroud Runners can use their speed and their durability, which, while modest early on, is actually pretty good in the late game, to help you control midfield objectives and or pick up your opponent's hard to reach backfield objective holders who become vulnerable without support. So think like a unit of Chaos Cultists. When there are no longer any legionaries in the backfield, if you can get to the backfield and kill the cultists, there's kind of nothing your opponent can do to retaliate. So those hard to reach scoring units of your opponents are super vulnerable, especially in the late game, to Shroud Runners. And because, as I already mentioned, Shroud Runners can get to a 2-up saving in cover. If you also drop lightning fast reactions on them, they're actually really robust against volume of fire from small arms. It takes a lot of bolter shots, or a crap load of autogun shots, or even a lot of shuriken fire, regular shuriken fire, to wipe out a squad of Shroud Runners, especially if you make them -1 to hit. So if your opponent doesn't have any of their vehicle popping heavy weapons left, or stuff that does flat 3 damage, they can really endure some serious fire. And so you get to that point in the game, you can use your Shroud Runners to start grabbing midfield objectives. Usually Craftworlds want to score big on turns 4 and 5 on primary objectives, and Shroud Runners can help you do that. The other thing to remember is that if you run them in an Ulthway list, when they have that 6-up invuln save, even if your opponent does have a couple of meltaguns or las cannons or things that would just pop them, if you set a couple of strands of fate die aside and you drop them on a midfield objective with 1 bike at least in a ruin, your opponent can open up with 3 meltaguns and 30 shots from a small arms fire, Skitarii or something, and the bike unit can still be a lot. 1 or 2 bikes can still be alive after that volley of fire to score the objective for you on the next turn, which is pretty good. The other way to use Shroud Runners in a target elimination role is to use the pregame move plus another 16 inches when you actually get your turn to get into your opponent's backfield and kill something soft and fragile that really needs to die. And it's worth noting that if you're setting this up, so you make your pregame move of 16 inches, it might be that you then don't get first turn, and instead you have to use Phantasm to pick up your Shroud Runners. You're probably also picking up your Striking Scorpions, maybe a unit of Rangers that you want to use to score scout the enemy or something. This is more of a first turn play, but if you can make the 16-inch move before the game and then another 16-inch move into your opponent's backfield to target something that's totally out of line of sight, it might be worth it if you can kill, say, in a mirror match, a big unit of Swooping Hawks. Yeah, you're probably going to lose your Shroud Runners, but it's totally worth it if you can prevent the Swooping Hawks from doing what they would otherwise do for the whole game, which is endlessly jump into the midfield and light up your fragile elves. Swooping Hawks are a fabulous unit in a mirror matchup. And so if you can take your opponent's Swooping Hawks away and still have yours, that gives you a big edge in a mirror match. And then keep in mind that if you do this, right, you do the 32-inch move, you light up the thing that really needs to die. When your opponent's turn comes around, you can get one last hurrah out of the Shroud Runners by using the Wire Weave Grenade Strat for 1 CP to just automatically do D3 mortal wounds to something. It's like a smite. And that can be useful too. Especially if you can kill a Shining Spear or something in this imaginary mirror match. Totally worth it. Now, this Alpha Strike approach can work especially well in combination with other units that are a turn 1 threat. So some armies in 40k, some lists are built with Alpha Strike potential. What an Alpha Strike army does is it totally keeps its head down until you get a turn, and then the first time you hit your opponent, so hard with such overwhelming force that it's very difficult for them to ever bounce back, right? It just gives you an edge for the rest of the game, and that's how you win. Some Eldar lists are designed to do this in some matchups. There's some matchups where Alpha Strike is not going to work for you. If your opponent is running something that's super durable and that's all turtled up together, you probably don't want to sacrifice a bunch of units in an Alpha Strike maneuver. But in some matchups with against opponents who are running stuff that's a bit more fragile, or on long boards, right, where everything is maybe spread out lengthwise in your opponent's backfield, there might be portions of your opponent's army on one flank or the other that are vulnerable to a powerful Alpha Strike maneuver. So you need to have a list that's built to be able to do this. But alongside, say, a squad of striking scorpions, perhaps a couple of falcons coming in with a turn 1 deep strike, maybe one is full of banshees and the other is full of avengers, and those scout bikes, your Shroud Runners that make a turn 1 move and then move again, you can potentially put such overwhelming pressure on one part of your opponent's army that there just isn't enough left in that part of the field to mount a proper response when her turn comes around. And in that case, your Shroud Runners, along with the rest of your Alpha Strike team, can either hold on to that part of the table for tactical reasons. Maybe there's an objective over there. Maybe you need it for hidden path. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe you're scoring, what's it called? Behind enemy lines, right? And you just want units over there to do that. Maybe you also have Scout the Enemy. Ooh, tricky. So you're performing Scout the Enemy in your opponent's backfield with one of those units for 4 points a turn, right? Or maybe your Alpha Strike team on turn 2 then rockets into what's remains of your opponent's army like a wrecking ball, and you trade your Alpha Strike team to do another 400 points of damage or whatever. And at that point, you're far enough ahead of your opponent in points that it just isn't possible for her to claw her way back. Also, sometimes pressure on your opponent's backfield is what's necessary to give a Craftworld's army the ability to play the midfield. We all know that elves are fragile. It can be very hard to score those midfield objectives early on. And if you can give your opponent something else to worry about that she absolutely has to address, often that's what it takes in order to be able to max out your primary score or get at least to 35 with it, which is, I think, sort of minimally where you need to be if you're playing competitively. Really, obviously, you want to get to 45, but you don't want to score less than or about 35. So for more about playing the Alpha Strike team, I could talk for another 30 minutes about that. But for more about Alpha Strike, consider watching my video about Ynnari tactics in competitive play. Much of what I discuss in that video, how and where to assign strands of fate and what psychic powers to use, what sorts of units are effective, is just as relevant regardless of whether you're playing Ynnari or a traditional Craftworld. There are all kinds of fun tricks, like you have a Farseer Skyrunner with Doom and Executioner nip out, cast Doom on something out of line of sight, drop Executioner for D3 plus 3 mortal wounds, and then quicken back behind your own line, and then you come in with all that other stuff. You could even put a Psyker and one of those deep striking Falcons or something like Azerman. Ooh. I will say that the Wire Weave Grenade strat, if you're doing the Alpha Strike combo, is also probably compulsory in that circumstance, because you need your team to do as much damage as possible in mortal wounds. There's probably something in your opponent's backfield that's being targeted by the Alpha Strike team that is either especially vulnerable to or is to mortal wounds or is difficult to damage, and so mortal wounds are useful for that. Lastly, in many matchups, Shroud Runners can be used in non-combat tactical roles. Their speed and moderate late-game durability can help you Scout the Enemy. For those of you who don't know what Scout the Enemy is, because maybe you're very new to this, I mentioned this before, it's a Craftworld's specific, Craftworld's unique secondary objective. It's an action-based secondary objective that can be performed either in the midfield, at least 6 inches from your own deployment zone, or in your opponent's deployment zone. If it's performed in the midfield, you score 2 points. If it's performed in your opponent's backfield, you score 4 points. If you do it with an infantry unit of Rangers, it's completed at the end of your turn. If you do it with any other unit, it completes at the beginning of your next command phase, which means you have to survive your opponent's turn. But keep in mind that because Shroud Runners are so fast, you may be able to get them into your opponent's backfield, especially in the late game, to get them into your opponent's backfield in or behind a ruin at a point in the game where, your opponent can shoot at them, but especially with that 2-up save, especially if you use lightning fast reactions, or maybe that trick I mentioned before with the invuln save and the strands of fate die, if you're running Ulthway, your opponent just can't kill them, and all they have to do is survive. So that is yet another one of these like non-combat tactical uses for this unit that can really pay off. Keep in mind also that the ability to pick up something in your opponent's backfield. This is a combat roll, but it's a scoring trick. In the late game, the speed of those bikes, you may have to decide what's more useful. Should I score 4 points instead of 2 points for scout the enemy, or because if you do the action you can't shoot, or should I shoot and kill my opponent's primary scoring cultists or whatever on this objective? That might mean that your opponent doesn't score 4 points and you score 4 extra points because you now control more objectives than your opponent, at which point obviously you shoot the thing instead of doing the action and just score 2 points for scout the enemy elsewhere in the field. Sorry, that's a little bit, if you're a new player, that's a little bit complex and probably a bit much. Okay, also worth noting, one of the tactical advantages to Shroud Runners that doesn't really have anything to do with killing enemy units is that when they're in that sort of like long range artillery role in your own backfield, I mentioned before, where they're shooting and then battle focusing out of line of sight, you can position them such that on one of your flanks, you're screening enemy deep strikers out of a whole section of your backfield. It's nice to have stuff that can screen out deep strikers while still participating in the battle. And because your opponent probably doesn't have any deep strikers after turn 3, there's just a really nice synergy here, which is where, like, for the first 3 turns, your Shroud Runners are behaving like artillery and they're screening out deep strikers. And then on turns 4 and 5, as I mentioned before, when your opponent doesn't have a lot left on the table, they zip out into the midfield, they control objectives, they pick up hard to reach objective holders, they help you scout the enemy, they perform these other roles. But early on, one of the advantages to having them in your list instead of something else is that they can participate in the battle while also screening out deep strikers. That's pretty good. Finally, their large bases make them powerful move blockers. That is a unit that you position specifically to get in the way of an opponent's unit that really needs to be somewhere on the field that now it can't get to. Shroud Runners are a little expensive to be a throwaway unit in this role, where you're giving up 105 points to prevent your opponent's very valuable unit from getting to where it needs to be. But it might occasionally be worth trading them to tie something up in the midfield. I'm not going to rehash all of the reasons that unit trades for move blocking sometimes really make sense. I recently did that in my video about Wind Riders, so if you want to hear me defend that claim, check that video out. But also keep in mind that move blocking doesn't always require you to sacrifice a unit. It often also just doesn't occur to even moderate, like mid-level, intermediate competitive players to move block, because it's very gamey. It feels less like the role-playing side of 40K, where you're creating the space battle, and it's much more treating it a bit like chess. But move blocking is powerful. You don't necessarily have to give the unit up to do it. So consider if you were to, for example, move a unit of Shroud Runners right in front of an enemy transport that doesn't fly, like a Rhino. You could keep it in your opponent's backfield, and that Rhino doesn't have anything that's really a threat to the Shroud Runners. You might have to quicken them. You obviously don't want to do that, because when they make a quicken move, or even if you advance them, they then can't. All of their weapons are heavy weapons. They're not shooting, but sometimes it might be worth doing. Or maybe your opponent has a big, dangerous monster that needs to move between a couple of ruins, because monsters, they can't breach ruins, and you can position your Shroud Runners such that you just totally trap that unit. And then I mentioned before that even though that monster is dangerous, I mentioned before that in an Ulthway list, you have a 6-up feel no pain. So even if the monster charges the Shroud Runners, and you could use your wire weave grenades to do a mortal wound and maybe try to make it fail the charge, but even if it gets there, the ability to, in an Ulthway list, spend Strands of Fate to just auto succeed, even if it's a pretty dangerous melee monster, you can probably survive with the squad of Shroud Runners against a lot of those types of unit. And then when your turn rolls around again, because it's a flying unit, you just fly out of combat with the monster, and before it can fight you on your own turn, and score behind enemy lines or do something else, right? It doesn't necessarily mean giving up the unit if you use it to move block. Okay, obstacles to using Shroud Runners effectively. Probably the largest obstacle to using Shroud Runners effectively is their total lack of AP on the scatter lasers. Yes, the long rifles have a -1. Great. But but the majority of their fire output is at no AP. And in a meta where there's just a ton of tough infantry saving up on a 2-up in cover, the reality is that if you just ping away at stuff with your scatter lasers, they're not likely to do much damage in those matchups. And on the one hand, this is kind of fine. Like your Shroud Runners are not going to be the all-star unit in every game you play. That's part of what it means to have a balanced list. A balanced list has ways of answering different kinds of obstacles and different kinds of matchups. But you have to think that each of the tools that you bring to the table will not be equally valuable in every matchup. That's the point of a balanced list. The good list is like, oh, what a crappy metaphor. It's like a Swiss Army knife. I wonder if they even have Swiss Army. Is that Swiss listeners? Do you actually have Swiss Army knives in Switzerland, or is that just an American thing that we call? I don't know. I have no idea. But maybe when you were a kid, you had a Swiss Army knife, and it was a knife with all those different tools. That's what a good Craftworld's list is like. You don't need each of those tools on every camping. Sorry, I hate this metaphor too, but I just have to finish it now. You're not going to use each of the tools in the Swiss Army knife on every camping trip, but having them is important so that you can overcome any kind of obstacle you might encounter. That said, there is a way to play around that total lack of AP. Ooh, I'm still feeling bad about that metaphor. Sorry, guys. And that's to have Jinx in your tactical quiver. So Jinx is a Runes of Battle psychic power that reduces the save characteristic of the target by 1, which, if your target was saving on a 2+ before, is doubling the number of failed saves. So before they were saving, they were failing 1 in 6, and now they're failing 1 in 3. And because the volume of fire is pretty good on a scatter bike, 21 shots, some of those are at -1 too. You're actually getting a bunch of shots through. And here's the other thing. Jinx is like a workaround for Armor of Contempt. Because Armor of Contempt reduces incoming AP, but Jinx just applies to the enemy armor value. So essentially, if you're shooting a unit with Jinx, okay, concrete example, Space Marines, they have Armor of Contempt. If they're in cover, they would normally save on a 2-up. Shooting them with a scatter, it doesn't matter actually if they're in cover or not. Shooting them with a scatter laser, if they are jinxed, is the equivalent of the scatter laser having AP -2. Because Armor of Contempt, they ignore the first AP, and then the second one would bring them from a 3-up save to a 4-up, or in cover, a 2-up to a 3-up. And if you were to shoot those same Space Marines with, say, a Dire Avenger Shuriken Catapult with a -2 AP, you'd be in the exact same place, because the Armor of Contempt eats the first -1 of the AP, and it ends up effectively being a -1 AP. So scatter lasers and swooping hawks are essentially at -2 AP against an Armor of Contempt target when you jinx it, which is great. And against Armor of Contempt, the -1 on the long rifles doesn't even matter. For all intents and purposes, the long rifles and the scatter lasers are the same. So a solid strategy in a matchup against durable armies that have Armor of Contempt is to throw Jinx on a target unit, say, I don't know, a bunch of Terminators out in the open or something on a midfield objective, and then you light them up with both your Shroud Runners and your Swooping Hawks. And together they have some pretty serious volume of fire. A larger unit of Hawks with Guide on it too. Oh, now it's getting serious. And then both the Hawks and the bikes, the Shroud Runners, battle focus to safety. There's nothing your opponent can do to retaliate. And those Terminators might have been saving on a 3-up, but you've put some serious volume of fire into that unit. Even if they're both MSU units, you're looking at like 42 shots, and the Swooping Hawks were auto-wounding on 6s and re-rolling all of their everything that wasn't a 6 with Guide on the first time through. You're going to pick some of them up. Even Terminators, you're going to pick some of them up, and that is fabulous. That means that these units that maybe are not well equipped to deal with really heavy armor have a way to play against that really heavy armor in matchups where that matters. Now, if you're worried, you might be thinking, but Brent, you already, the 36-inch range, the thing that I want to target is probably pretty far away. It's probably on my opponent's side of the table. Jinx has an 18-inch range. I don't want to just sacrifice a Warlock every time I want to shoot something with my scatter lasers. Surely you're not asking me to do that. I am not asking you to do that. You use the boomerang trick. So you send out the Warlock on the bike. You move it within 18 inches of the target. You cast Jinx on the target. Save your Strands of Fate die unless you have 2 Psychic Strands of Fate die. You cast Jinx on the target. If you're running Ulfway, you're at +1. If you're running Children of Prophecy, right? But hopefully you succeed on Jinx. You can also do a reroll if you need to. You Jinx the thing, and then you use another Warlock with Quicken to cast Quicken on the first Warlock, and it nips 22 inches back behind your lines and is totally safe. And what this does is it gives you your Jinx power, essentially a 36-inch range from wherever the Warlock with Quicken is, because that Warlock is an 18-inch range, and then to Quicken, and then the Warlock that's getting quickened has an 18-inch range with Jinx. Sorry, maybe I'm over-explaining that, but it's a great trick. The boomerang psyker trick is fantastic. It gives you so much more play with your Eldar psychic tricks, also with scoring psychic interrogation or warp ritual. Last note, if you don't have guide cast on your Hawks in the early part of the game, if you have that backline Farseer who has, say, guide and, I don't know, Will of Azurian, or maybe that Runes of Fortune power that gets you a CP back. I use it every game, and for some reason I'm blanking on it. Is that Faithful Divergence? I don't know. So that one. Your backline Farseer, if you don't have another target for guide, your Shroud Runners are a great target for guide, right? They have a high volume of fire, so being able to reroll all your misses definitely counts for something. So that's what I've got. Shroud Runners are really good target elimination units against non-power armor armies. They can hover in the backfield as long-range artillery. In the late game, they're good for controlling mid-board objectives. They're good for scoring secondary objectives. They're good for getting into your opponent's backfield and picking up hard-to-reach objective holders. They're good for picking up the units that your opponent needs to score secondary objectives, right? Maybe your opponent has some swooping hawk equivalent that is trying to score action-based secondaries. Your Shroud Runners can pick that unit up. They're good for screening out enemy deep strikers, and with the right combination of debuffs and trickery, they even have good target elimination potential into those heavily armored targets that are otherwise kind of tricky for them. Don't forget about the Wire Weave Grenade strat. It's super powerful. You also have the option to trade your Shroud Runners for something that really needs to die, that's hard to reach on your opponent's side of the table, or they can be part of a highly versatile Alpha Strike team that might sometimes be Alpha Strikers and might sometimes play the game differently. That's a lot of tricks. That's a pretty great unit. Before I sign off, I will say that if you have your own ideas about how to use Shroud Runners effectively, please mention them in the comments below. Or if you just want to help out my algorithm, please leave a comment below. I hope that you will like and subscribe if you've not subscribed. My patrons enjoy early access to these videos. They also get to participate in a Discord, which is very active and delightfully has some really high-end Eldar players in it. Also, if you want to be listening to these as a podcast instead, patrons can download the WAV files of these videos the same way you would a podcast and listen to them at ease. So just in case there's somebody out there who's ready to take the dive and become a patron, I will link my patron and merch page in the video description. Thanks so much, guys. It's been great. I'll be back again soon with another unit focus video, and I look forward to talking to you again in the near future.